This is the minorities' position in respect to the happenings in our country. Ghanaians woke up yesterday to scenes that have become tragically familiar under this administration. Major parts of our national capital submerged, homes destroyed, livelihood washed away, and citizens stranded in the very city that houses the seat of government. This is not an isolated weather event. It is the predictable consequence of a government that talks about preparedness while doing nothing to deliver it. Today, we find ourselves a nation in mourning. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, before anything else is said, we must pause. Behind every flooded street and every submerged home is a family whose world has been upended overnight. Tonight, somewhere in this city, a mother is sitting by a hospital bed, holding the hand of a child she nearly lost. Tonight, somewhere else, a husband is searching for a wife who has not come home. Somewhere, a father is standing in the wreckage of a shop he built with his own two hands over 20 years, watching everything he worked for float away in brown water. These are not statistics. These are our people. Ghana is still counting on its losses, and we fear that what we know today is only a fraction of what we still come to learn in the days ahead. To the families who have lost loved ones, to those keeping vigil beside hospital beds, not knowing whether their relatives will recover, to the traders and artisans and ordinary working Ghanaians who have lost everything they spent a lifetime building. We, the MPP minority, feel your pain. We are your neighbors, your relatives, your constituent too, and your grief is our grief. We hold you in our prayers tonight and in the days to come. But our compassion does not end with words of comfort. We make this solemn promise to every Ghanaian touched by this tragedy. We, the mighty minority, will use every tool of accountability available to us, both within this house and beyond it, to ensure that those whose negligence contributed to this disaster answer for it. Your losses deserve more than sympathy. It deserves justice, and the minority will not rest until you have it. Now, let me go back to the task force that existed on paper and on paper alone. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, last year, His Excellency the President announced the establishment of an anti-flood task force, specifically charged with preparing the capital for the rainy season, chaired by his Deputy Chief of Staff in charge of operations, Mr. Stan Jose Dogwe. The public was assured that lessons had been learned and that the year would be different. Yesterday's flooding is the clearest evidence that this task force produced no meaningful intervention on the ground. If serious drainage works, the silting or flood mitigation infrastructure had been undertaken, the impact of the rains, however heavy, would have been measurably reduced. Instead, entire neighborhoods went underwater, exposing the gap between government rhetoric and government delivery. Now we see a pattern, not an accident. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, this was not the first flooding incident of the year. Weeks earlier, significant parts of Accra were already inundated at a time when the president was out of the country on an official visit that took him through the United Kingdom and Belarus. On his return, rather than point to work already completed by the task force, the president called for a fresh presentation and mapping of affected areas. The government that had genuinely prepared for the rains would not need to commission a new assessment after the damage had already been done. The need for an after-the-fact presentation is itself an admission that no adequate plan existed beforehand. Sanitation policy without a plan. We note that this government has announced a sanitation policy without a plan. Compounding the crisis is the government's decision not to renew waste management contracts with some contractors, following concerns raised about the term of these contracts. The minority does not dispute that public purse must be protected from poorly structured agreements. However, terminating or declining to renew a major waste collection arrangement without first putting in place credible alternatives has consequences. In the resulting vacuum, informal and unregulated waste collectors, commonly referred to as aboboya operators, have proliferated. There is documented video evidence of such operators dumping refuse directly into gutters and drains. Blocked drainage systems are a direct and significant contributor to urban flooding. A government cannot dismantle a sanitation system without securing its replacement, then act surprised when the resulting refuse chokes the city's drains. Rainfall is not an excuse for the absence of a plan. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, the president stated yesterday that approximately 140 millimeters of rain fell on Accra, compared to a higher single-day figure of about 56 millimeters recorded last year, and argued that this is, quote, beyond our control, end quote, while pointing instead to human behavior, including structured builds in waterways. The minority does not dispute that rainfall intensity is a climate reality outside government's control, but that is precisely why preparedness matters most in years of extreme rainfall, not least in them. A competent administration plans for the worst case scenario, not the average one. Ghana's meteorological agencies issue seasonal forecasts every year, and a task force was specifically constituted months ago to prepare the capital for exactly this kind of event. If, by the government's own admission, human encroachment on waterways is a known and long-standing contributor to flooding, then a task force that had been doing its job would have addressed that risk well before the rains arrived, not have it cited today as an explanation after the damage is done. The president cannot simultaneously claim that human behavior drove this disaster and that this government bears no responsibility for failing to act on a risk it knew about and was specifically tasked to manage. Now we need accountability. Government must account to the people and not give excuses. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, we, the minority, submit that government cannot simultaneously claim to have prepared for the floods and then be caught needing fresh maps and fresh presentations once disaster strikes. It cannot dismantle an existing waste management arrangement without a replacement and then point to clogged drains as a natural disaster rather than a policy failure. The people of Accra deserve a government that plans ahead, not one that manages crisis after they have already destroyed homes and livelihood. A call for parliamentary inquiry. We contend that given the scale of this failure, statement of regret and after-the-fact relief packages are not sufficient. The minority is calling on this House to establish a parliamentary committee specifically mandated to investigate the conduct of the Flood Preparedness Task Force and the relevant government ministries and agencies in the lead up to this disaster. That inquiry must establish what work, if any, the task force undertook since its establishment, what funds were allocated to it, and how they were spent, what specific mitigation measures were planned and implemented, and why none of this prevented or meaningfully reduced the impact of foreseeable seasonal flooding. Those found responsible for negligence or dereliction of duty must be held accountable. Pending the outcome of this inquiry, the minority demands that all members of the task force step aside from their roles. This is not a presumption of guilt. It is a basic standard accountability that any institution facing serious questions over its conduct should observe, so that the investigation can proceed without interference and so that those under scrutiny are not left to oversee the very response to a crisis their own inaction may have worsened. This house owes the people of Accra nothing less than a full and honest accounting of what went wrong and who was responsible. Now, a warning from history the NDC has refused to heed. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, Ghanaians do not need to be reminded twice of what happens when flooding in this city is met with government complacency. On the 9th of June 3rd, 2015, under an NDC administration with President John Dramani Mahama as its head, floodwaters at Kwame Nkrumah Circle mixed with leaking fuel at a oil filling station and ignited, killing an estimated 150 people in one of the deadliest peacetime disasters in Ghana's history. A subsequent investigation found that the flooding itself was a remote cause and recommended urgent dredging and desilting of the Odo River and its tributaries to prevent a reoccurrence. Successive governments share responsibility for the slow pace of implementing those recommendations. But it is this NDC administration, having returned to office, promising a fresh start and having specifically constituted a task force this year to prepare the capital for the rain, that bears responsibility for the renewed flooding in the very same Odo corridor at the Braka, Odona, and the Kwame Nkrumah Circle enclave this week. This time, the disaster was again accompanied by fire. A blaze broke out at Odona Rubber Market near Kwame Nkrumah Circle, just meters from the site of the 2015 tragedy, as floodwaters submerged the surrounding areas. Fire crews managed to contain the blaze without loss of lives, and for that, the minority commenced Ghana National Fire Service. But the fact that Accra came this close in the same neighborhood to a repeat of June 3rd is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of a government, once again led by President Mahama and the NDC, that has failed for over a decade to act decisively on the lessons of its own worst disaster. The minority will not allow this government and its new team of advisors and task force officials to preside over a replay of the scenes of June 3rd, 2015. Ghana paid too high a price that night to watch history repeat itself through nothing more than official negligence. Now, a public health emergency in the making. Flooding of this scale carries a public health dimension that cannot be left unaddressed. And our respected colleague Nana Ayu Efriye raised this on the House floor. Stagnant flood water mixed with uncollected refuse and overflowing sanitation facilities create conditions for the rapid spread of communicable diseases, including cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne and vector-borne illnesses. The minority is therefore pressing for an urgent and substantive briefing to this House by the Minister for Health, setting out precisely what steps are being taken to monitor affected communities for early signs of disease outbreak, what emergency sanitation, clean water, and medical supplies have been deployed to flood-hit areas, and what surveillance and rapid response systems are in place should an outbreak occur. This briefing must happen without delay. The country cannot afford a public health crisis compounding a disaster that was itself avoidable. Now, let me deal with complacency by another name, Galamsey and the Gold Board connection. The government's negligence on flooding cannot be separated from its broader record on environmental governance. And nowhere is that record more damning than on Galamsey. The president and senior figures in this administration campaigned explicitly on a promise to end illegal mining, with some of their own officials while in opposition, claiming the menace could be eliminated within weeks of taking office. Nearly 2 years into this government, that promise lies in ruins. Illegal mining has continued to expand. Rivers and water bodies central to Ghana's drainage and irrigation systems have been further degraded, and forest cover that once absorbed rainfall and reduced runoff continues to disappear. Far from confronting this crisis, government policy has entrenched it. The Bank of Ghana's Gold for Reserves program and the establishment of Gold Board as both regulator and the dominant commercial buyer for gold have created a structure in which the state itself has become guaranteed market for gold of uncertain origin, including credible voices both within and outside parliament have warned gold sourced from illegal operations. when the body charged with sanitizing the gold trade cannot reliably distinguish legally mined gold from galamsey gold and yet continues to expand its purchasing target, it is not fighting illegal mining, it is financing it. This is not a side issue to the flooding crisis. Illegal mining destroys the very watersheds, wetlands, and river systems that would otherwise absorb and channel rainfall away from our cities and farmlands. A government that subsidizes the destruction of these natural defenses with one hand cannot credibly claim with the other that this year's flooding was simply an act of nature. The minority holds the government fully accountable for galamsey policy that, contrary to its own campaign promise, is compounding the very disaster it now claims to be responding to. Support for victims without absorbing government. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, the presidency announced the release of 300 million from the contingency fund, split evenly between urgent relief for flood-affected persons and communities, that is 150 million for them, and flood mitigation measures, 150 million, alongside the deployment of Ghana Armed Forces and police to support NADMO in rescue and relief operations. The minority welcomes this relief and will not stand in the way of support reaching affected Ghanaians. But relief after the fact, however large, is not a substitute for the prevention that was promised months ago and never delivered. An aerial tour of the devastation today does not undo the absence of a functioning plan before the rains came. Compassion for the victims of this crisis and accountability for the government that failed to prevent it are not mutually exclusive. Both are necessary, and the minority insists on both. The minority demands detailed, itemized reporting to this House on how the full 300 million will be disbursed and spent, broken down by recipient community, project, and contractor where applicable, together with documentary evidence of full compliance with the Public Financial Management Act and all other applicable transparency and procurement requirements. This reporting must distinguish clearly between the 150 million allocated to direct relief and the 150 million allocated to mitigation works, with regular progress updates to Parliament under the funds are fully accounted for. We, the mighty minority, will also be seeking full transparency and parliamentary oversight on how the 150 million mitigation allocation is spent, given that an earlier task force established for the very same purpose has yet to account for its own use of public resources. Ghanaians have seen too many large contingency disbursements announced with fanfare and never properly accounted for. This must not be another one. The NDC government is known for its optical settings instead of doing the real work. Critically, this disbursement must not be confined to Accra alone. Flooding in recent weeks has also affected communities in Western, Central, Eastern, Volta, and Ashanti regions. And the minority insists that the 350 million package be applied equitably across all affected regions, not concentrated solely on the national capital because it draws the most media attention. Government must publish a full breakdown of relief and mitigation spending by region so that flood-hit Ghanaians outside Accra are not left behind simply because their suffering received less television coverage. Our flag bearer's message to the nation: whilst government grapples with the consequences of its own failures, our flag bearer, Dr. Muhammad Baumia, has spoken directly to the suffering of ordinary Ghanaians. Yesterday, he issued a statement of sympathy and solidarity with flood victims. Today, he has walked the talk. He has gone further, personally touring the hard-hit areas of Accra to assess the situation on the ground and stand directly with affected communities. In his statement issued yesterday morning, he said, quote, "This morning, my thoughts and prayers are with the thousands of people affected by the flood. My deepest sympathies to those who have lost their loved ones, properties, and those who have been forced out of their homes. I urge citizens to comply with all directives issued by the government and to cooperate fully with institutions mandated to address the situation. I also urge the emergency services and all relevant authorities to do everything possible to reach those in need and assist them. We will get through this difficult time by caring for one another. God bless our homeland, Ghana. End quote. This is the tone of leadership Ghana needs in a moment of crisis. Solidarity with victims, a call for citizens to cooperate with relief efforts, and an appeal to national unity without losing sight of the human cost of this disaster. It stands as a reminder that holding government accountable for its failures and standing with the Ghanaian people in their hour of need are not contradictory. They are both part of the same patriotic duty. Thank you very much indeed.